Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Monday everybody. I hope you had a restful weekend and I wish you all a productive week ahead. My apologies for no video on Saturday. Looking at the analytics last week, it seems that there was some viewer fatigue getting to the Thursday and Friday episodes, so I thought that I would give you a break from the episodes and just not put one up. Now, we actually have a lot to cover today, so let's just jump right in. Chinese tax authorities are urging wealthy individuals and businesses to double-check their tax payments, aiming to uncover any unpaid liabilities. This move, which has stirred concern among the affluent, is part of a broader effort by local governments to replenish depleted revenues, largely due to the property market downturn. The government is anticipated to soon announce a fiscal stimulus package designed to address local government budget shortfalls and support economic recovery. Indeed, we'll be covering that later this week. In response, tax officials have asked individuals and businesses to conduct so-called self-inspections and pay any owed taxes, including on personal overseas investments. In some cities, businesses that find no issue in their records are required to submit stamped confirmation letters to keep documentation on hand for potential future inspections. Recent data reveals that government income from land sales, a major revenue source, dropped by nearly 25% in the first 9 months of the year, and total tax revenue declined by over 5%. This is after already several years of revenue being hit by the property crisis. One high-profile commentator observed that this alone has been crippling for China. This financial strain has led many local authorities to impose higher fines on businesses to boost revenue. Indeed, we've covered this in the past. Some provinces, including Beijing and Chongqing, saw significant increases in revenue from fines, though many have stopped reporting this due to its rapid rise and the resulting public concern. The increased pressure on taxpayers has led some wealthy individuals to negotiate with authorities regarding their liabilities, and it's created a sense of fear among the wealthy, especially in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen. And of course, older folks will remember the class warfare of the Mao era. Analysts suggest that while raising taxes on affluent individuals and certain companies is less likely to directly impact most residents, it risks further weakening business and investor confidence if the scope of enforcement expands. UK-based The Financial Times writes over the weekend that additionally some businesses have begun reporting unexpected tax liabilities. For instance, Hesun Pharmaceutical discovered a tax debt of 18 million RMB, and Guizhou Gas paid an extra 20 million RMB following self-inspections. Local governments are also tightening their tax surveillance systems, enabling greater data sharing across departments and financial institutions to enhance monitoring. Experts warn, writes the Financial Times, that despite the revenue collection push, it may still fall short of meeting fiscal needs. Longer-term solutions may include expanding the tax base, potentially incorporating property-related taxes. Another option, of course, is to reduce China's fiscal ambitions generally. But this, of course, would greatly reduce the political power of the central and local governments. Next up, this is a development that I recorded on Saturday but ultimately decided not to upload. This particular development was too important to leave behind, so I've included it here. This week, US-based Rhodium Group published an excellent report called End of the Line, The Cost of Faltering Reforms. The report argues that compared to its own 2010 baseline, China has improved. However, further progress has been elusive. It also explains, after delaying major policy moves in 2023, China announced a major slate of reforms at the long-awaited third plenum of the Chinese Communist Party in July this year. It faces enormous challenges. 2023 saw lackluster growth, continued property sector woes, and growing foreign pushback against manufacturing overcapacity and the treatment of foreign firms. China's reform experience in 2023 and its successes and failures set the stage for the new reforms. To track Beijing's reform efforts to date, Rhodium's China Pathfinder compared China's economic system to those of market economies, using 6 components of the market model: financial system development, market competition, modern innovation system, trade openness, direct investment openness, and portfolio investment openness.
They established a quantitative framework for understanding China's progress or regression on reform. China's outsized role in the global economy and the necessity of reform to maintain the country's growth makes this work key to understanding China's future trajectory. The report has 6 key findings, which we will summarize here. 1. Compared to its own 2010 baseline, China has improved. In all of the clusters analyzed by China Pathfinder, China has narrowed the gap with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. However, further progress has been elusive, and their indicators suggest China has hit limits on convergence with the OECD. This gap will likely remain in the coming years. 2. In market competition, especially since the presence of state-owned enterprises in the economy, but also more broadly, China is unwilling to make the concessions to the traditional role of the state in its economy necessary to achieve more durable structural reform. 3. China's progress stalled in several areas tracked by China Pathfinder. These include innovation, as China's fiscal constraints begin to have a meaningful impact on its technological and development capacity in some metrics. They also include trade, where security concerns and geopolitics, including uncertainty over data and security rules, weigh on China's trade openness. Even as China exported more and more in 2023 and became increasingly important for marginal economic growth, services trade has been affected. 4. In a narrow sense, China saw more progress in dealing with financial challenges in 2023. Beijing prevented debt emergencies in the property sector and local government financing space from triggering a general financial crisis and resulting slowdown in credit, and cleanup was reflected in an improvement of China's financial system reform score. Its composite cluster score surpassed that of several OECD countries for the first time since 2020. However, such achievements are modest compared to ongoing problems: poor quality financial intermediation, declining capital productivity, and deviations from market financial regulatory principles. 5. Developed market scores continued to decline on average in several categories, including innovation and market competition. This shows some reform backsliding and a resurgence of industrial policy and geo-economic security policy in the OECD, even as most countries remain well ahead of where they were in 2010. 6. There were more data obstacles now to analyzing China's economy than in 2019, including data lags and delays that hamper study and have a chilling effect on open discussion of economic problems in China. But alternative data and the rise in frank domestic and international economic commentary are improving these conditions.
Next up, we move to how China is thinking about the US election. But just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, I have a huge favor to ask. That is just to hit the like button. And if you have not done so already and you think you'd like to watch another one of these episodes in the future, subscribe. Sharing this episode with people who you think would get some value from it is also a tremendous help. And Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description for those who want to help keep the channel financially sustainable. Thank you so much. Of course, as the world knows, there is just a day or so before the Americans decide whether Donald Trump or Kamala Harris will be the next US president. Over the weekend, Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post held a special subscriber event where the executive director of the outlet, Chao Cheng-yen, China editor Wendy Wu, and North America Bureau Chief Robert Delaney shared their insider knowledge and discussed the election from a China perspective. To end today's video, I wanted to examine a few of the most salient comments made during the long event. So I have picked out a few excerpts and put it into written form, and we can move through these now. Question: what will a Trump victory mean for China? Chao Cheng-yen. At the risk of oversimplification, I will say that Trump represents greater uncertainty. The Chinese officials by now are familiar with him and his style, but no matter how powerful the president is, the complicated US-China relationship requires a lot of work between officials at all levels. China actually put 28 Trump administration officials on the sanctions list. What if Trump puts someone who is on the sanctions list back in the government? Over the past 4 years, China and the US have spent a lot of effort trying to build up communications. If Trump comes back, a lot of these working-level bureaucrats or officials will leave the White House, and then there will be a period of uncertainty. China and the US also spent a lot of capital to bring back military-to-military communication. If Trump actually comes back, his relations with the military leaders in the US at present are not very good, and he is probably going to bring a wholesale change to that. Then the two sides will need to work from scratch to rebuild trust between them. So all of this is going to be very difficult for the Chinese. People talk about Trump as someone who knows how to make a bargain, not someone who is going to have direct conflict with China. But I argue that the conflicts between China and the US are more structural rather than any individual's personal preference. Question. And a Harris victory. What would that mean? Chang Yan. Some people say that Harris will be more continuity for China, because by large Harris is going to inherit Biden's policy towards China. And then even though there will also be a round of changes, at least the framework will stay. But Harris will also be bringing her own people, and many people in charge of foreign affairs will probably leave. So that will bring a level of uncertainty as well. But it is just not going to be as great as with Mr. Trump. Question. Which candidate does China prefer in the White House? Chang Yan. I don't really think China has a clear preference because each brings its own issues, and also the relationship between China and the US is really more structural in terms of conflicts. The different candidate will mean that the rhetoric will be different, but the policy direction will remain probably more or less the same. For example, for the past 4 years, despite all the lobbying attempts to negotiate, the Biden administration has kept most of Trump's tariffs in place. Another example is the so-called China Initiative under Trump. Under Biden, they removed it, but actually they fully embraced something very similar. Question. No matter who is in the White House, what can we expect regarding the Chinese economy? Wendy Wu. China's economy is facing a lot of headwinds domestically and also externally. So no matter who is going to be in the White House for the next 4 years, China is going to face some questions. Is China going to fight a trade war on two fronts, both with the European Union and the United States? Is China going to face closer coordination on the tech and economic rivalry across the Atlantic? Will China face an escalation of the US technology containment strategy? And will China be able to find and expand its external markets in the emerging economies in the global south to counter the loss? But those external issues cannot be clearly cut from the domestic issues. And the fundamental issue and solution for this is for the Chinese leadership to restore economic resilience, to regain the public's and the foreign investors' confidence in China. The market's expectation for further fiscal stimulus is quite high. We really need to see something to take place on the ground to move the needle, to revitalize public confidence for career prospects, for income prospects and outlook. They have to really increase the transparency and policy consistency in order to dispel lingering suspicions and concerns for investors. If multinational companies continue to reallocate their Asian headquarters outside mainland China to Singapore or other cities, China is still going to face a really daunting challenge about this confidence crisis. Question. If former President Trump imposes large tariffs on China, what counter-tariffs would China impose on the US? Chang Yan. No matter whether it's Trump or Harris, I think it is inevitable that the US will put more tariffs on China. The reason is because it's a structural issue. It's not just a personal preference. Also, tariffs is actually a means, not an end. The first time Trump's goal was to actually force China to buy more products from the US and to balance this so-called unfair trade where China had a huge trade surplus against the US. The result is that China did end up buying much more from the US, particularly agriculture and energy products. So it's effective. That is why the Biden administration, despite all the lobbying and pressure, they by and large kept the Trump tariffs in place. Now, the Biden administration started what people called the technology war against China, trying to restrict the most sensitive and high-end of technology from China, not just the important exports, but also the capital flow and investment. The aim really is to keep the technology advantage over China. These policies are, in fact, quite effective. But gradually, people in Washington have started to realize the limitations to this approach.
The US may still have the lead over China in technology, but China is making up for this disadvantage by really strengthening its manufacturing capacity. Take, for example, chips. Before 2007, China's share of so-called legacy chip manufacturing was only 17%. Today, it is over 30%. So China today actually accounts for 30% of the global share in manufacturing. The rest of the G7 put together is actually still not at that level. In the US, particularly from the Trump side, a lot of the talk is about hollowing out the manufacturing jobs in the US, and the US elite are very eager to bring manufacturing back to the US for various reasons. One way for them to do that is to use tariffs to protect US manufacturing and to encourage Chinese and also other countries' manufacturers to move their factory to the US to set up a manufacturing center in the US. If Trump or Harris imposed tariffs on China, China's way of hitting back would be very different. Who's going to win this war? Where does it end? It really depends, because the US is weaponizing a lead in technology research, but China is weaponizing a unique manufacturing capacity. Question: what are the prospects for armed conflict in the region? Chang Yan: while we cannot completely rule it out, I don't think the likelihood is very high, because a lot of this depends on how China will react. Right now, China's priority is to restructure its economy. China's priority is to move up the value chain to complete the science and technology transformation. China realizes that time is on its side. China is in no rush to start an armed conflict with anyone. In terms of Taiwan, I think Beijing's priority now is to put enough pressure on Taiwan to make sure that Taiwan will not opt for a radical move. But at the same time, Beijing will use every opportunity to gradually squeeze Taiwan to force them back to the negotiation table. I also don't see how there is a political will in the US to go into direct conflict with China. Robert Delante: I agree. A Trump administration that actively pushes for anything that would trigger an attack across the Taiwan Strait would be way out of line with what he has said before. The number one concern across the American electorate is economics. If Harris wins, she would generally continue what Biden has done, and the Biden administration has been determined to keep high-level contact with Beijing. On both sides, you can see signs that they do not want to get into a conflict. Of course, Congress is another animal. Here ends the direct quotations from the event. I certainly hope, particularly on this last point, that they are correct. But of course, there are plenty of examples throughout history of great conflicts where neither party intended or wanted a war. For those viewers in the US, I wish you all a smooth and orderly election in the coming days. As someone who has lived outside of democracy for almost a decade now, I have a new appreciation for how beautiful an institution it is. When we vote, we celebrate this amazing system, and we remember how fortunate we are to live in one. That is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Monday, have a good week, and I will see you all tomorrow.